Most people who remember Elin Nordegren remember one night. Thanksgiving 2009, a fire hydrant, a shattered car window, and a marriage that fell apart in front of the entire world. For years afterward, she was framed simply as Tiger Woods' wife, a quiet figure standing in the background as fame and then his scandal. But the woman living her life today looks almost nothing like that old tabloid sketch. She didn't just get through the worst of it. She rebuilt, deliberately and on her own terms, and traded the spotlight for a life that's recognizably fully hers. There was no reality show, no tell-all memoir, no branded product line. Instead, Elin chose something far less flashy, an ordinary life. These days, she's known to show up to her kids' sports practices in South Florida dressed, simply, coffee in hand, managing the logistics of a large, blended household. It's a long way from the world of private jets and global headlines she once inhabited, and that's exactly the point. She didn't just leave her marriage behind. She stepped away from the entire idea of being a celebrity, and in doing so became far more interesting than the tabloid version of her ever was. Now in her mid-40s, she's also the mother of 6. People who still picture her with just her 2 oldest kids, Sam and Charlie, might be surprised by the scale of her current household. Since pairing up with former NFL tight end Jordan Cameron, Elin has built a large blended family. 3 children together, Zeta, Freya, and Arthur, plus Jordan's son from an earlier relationship. Running the household, by all accounts, takes serious organization. Something the woman once known mainly as a quiet, behind-the-scenes presence seems to manage with ease. But the more striking part of her story isn't the family math. It's what she chose to do with her education and career. Rather than capitalize on her fame, Elin went back to school and stayed there for the better part of a decade. She enrolled at Rollins College and pursued a psychology degree, eventually graduating with honors. From there, she continued her training, earning a master's degree focused on mental health counseling at Nova Southeastern University, and went on to become a licensed mental health counselor in Florida. She later founded her own practice, Yen Therapy, and has also been associated with a South Florida group counseling practice. There's something genuinely striking about that arc. A woman whose private pain was dissected publicly by tabloids for years built a second career around helping other people work through their own. Reports suggest her practice has scaled back at times. Her original LLC's business registration lapsed in the early 2020s, but she has continued working as a licensed counselor, and friends describe her as balancing that work with raising her large family rather than running it full-time. Her relationship with Tiger Woods today also looks very different from the bitterness many expected after the divorce. The two have built what's widely described as a genuinely cooperative co-parenting relationship. Earlier this year, when their son Charlie received recognition for a state championship in golf, both Elin and Tiger were there for him. Proof of a kind that 2 people who went through one of the most public divorces in sports history can still show up for their kids together. Tiger has spoken publicly in the past about considering her one of his closest friends, and Elin herself has said she has no regrets about the relationship and feels privileged to have witnessed part of his career. She didn't position herself as a victim, and she didn't lash out as a villain either. She built something quieter instead, a career grounded in helping people, and a family life that, by most outside accounts, looks settled and full. It's less a Hollywood comeback story and more a slow, deliberate rebuild, proof that a very public collapse doesn't have to be the final word on someone's life. To understand how unusual her path has been, it helps to look past the surface level. She's doing great now narrative and into the actual architecture of how she got there. After the most expensive celebrity divorce in sports history at the time, the easy, expected move would have been some version of reinvention through spending, a new relationship with someone equally famous, a flashy public statement, maybe a memoir cashing in on the scandal. Instead, Elin enrolled in college, and she didn't just dabble. She spent roughly a decade in formal education, working toward a career that had nothing to do with her past fame and everything to do with understanding the kind of pressure, scrutiny, and emotional fallout she'd lived through herself. While paparazzi were still occasionally trying to catch a photo of her, she was sitting in psychology classes studying mechanics of stress and trauma, subjects she had, in a very real sense, already lived through firsthand. By the time she crossed the stage at her Rollins College graduation, she had quietly dismantled the scorned wife narrative the tabloids had built around her, replacing it with something far less sensational but far more substantial: a credential, a discipline, and a plan. That academic foundation became the engine behind her financial and personal independence. Her divorce settlement, widely reported at around $100 million, gave her resources, but the real shift was in what she built with them. She invested in privacy as much as anything else, reportedly demolishing and rebuilding a Florida home from the ground up to suit a life lived largely outside the public eye. But arguably the more meaningful investment was professional, turning a credential into an actual practice, where she spends her working hours holding space for other people's struggles rather than being defined by her own. By 2026, that transformation looks essentially complete. She's no longer introduced primarily as Tiger Woods' ex-wife in the way she once was. She's a licensed clinician with her own client base, a mother managing a large household, and to her own children, several of whom weren't even born during her marriage to Woods, a figure whose tabloid past probably feels like ancient history. The ex-wife label hasn't disappeared because enough time has passed. It's faded because she built an identity substantial enough to replace it. To really appreciate the distance she's traveled, it's worth going back to the beginning, long before private jets and headline-grabbing divorces. Elin Nordegren grew up in Stockholm, the daughter of a radio journalist and a Swedish government minister, with an identical twin sister, Josephine. As a young woman, she worked retail jobs and did some modeling to help fund her studies, eventually enrolling at Lund University. There was nothing about her early life that pointed toward American sports world fame. If anything, she was aiming at something much more academic. The pivot came when she took a job as a nanny for the family of fellow Swede and professional golfer Jesper Parnevik, a move that brought her to the United States. It was through that connection, in 2001, that she met Tiger Woods, at the time arguably the most dominant and famous athlete on the planet. By most accounts, she wasn't initially swept off her feet. She was focused on her own studies and uninterested in inserting herself into the orbit of someone so famous. Woods, however, was persistent, and the relationship developed over following years, eventually leading to an engagement in 2003. What followed was, in many ways, a partnership of opposites, with the relentless, history-making American athlete and Nordegren the reserved, privacy-guarding Scandinavian presence beside him. She became known in golf circles as a fixture in the gallery who almost never spoke to media and rarely sought attention for herself, a sharp contrast to the machine of endorsements and headlines surrounding her husband. Friends from that period have described her as fiercely protective of their privacy, something that would later become almost ironic, given how thoroughly that privacy would eventually collapse. Their wedding on October 5, 2004 at the Sandy Lane Resort in Barbados was by most accounts an extraordinary production, which reportedly rented out a large portion of the resort and went considerable lengths to keep paparazzi away by both air and sea. Guests included high-profile figures from sports and entertainment, and the ceremony itself was widely covered as one of the more lavish celebrity weddings of the era. For a few years afterward, the couple settled into a version of domestic life that looked, from the outside, close to ideal: a Florida estate, 2 children, daughter Sam Alexis, born in 2007, and son Charlie Axel, born in early 2009, and a public image of stability that contrasted sharply with the pressures building underneath it. Elin, by her own later account, leaned heavily into motherhood during this period, often described as protective and private even as her husband's career and fame reached new heights. What the public didn't see at the time was a relationship under considerable strain. Tiger was frequently away, and the marriage that looked picture-perfect in photographs was, behind closed doors, increasingly difficult. Elin has since spoken about going through what she called the stages of grief over the loss of the family life she had wanted for her children, language that suggests the unraveling was already underway well before it became public. That unraveling reached its breaking point in the early hours of November 27, 2009, when Wood's car struck a fire hydrant and a tree outside their Florida home. The early explanation offered was that Elin had used a golf club to break the rear window and pull her husband from a vehicle. Within days, that account came under intense scrutiny, fueled by tabloid reports on an alleged affair that had surfaced just before the crash. What followed was one of the most extensively covered celebrity scandals of the era, as additional allegations of infidelity emerged in the weeks that followed. Through all of it, Elin largely declined to speak publicly, giving only 2 substantive interviews about the divorce in the years that followed. One in 2010, shortly after the split, and another in 2014. In both, she emphasized her commitment to building an independent life and a stable co-parenting relationship with Woods for the sake of their children, while also acknowledging she sought professional therapy herself to work through the experience. The divorce was finalized in August 2010, and the years since have been less about a dramatic public comeback and more about steady, largely private rebuilding. Elin pursued her education, built a career in mental health counseling, found a long-term partner in Jordan Cameron, and expanded her family. She and Woods have maintained a cooperative co-parenting relationship that both have spoken about positively over the years. It's a story without a tidy Hollywood ending, but with something arguably more durable. A woman who went through an extraordinarily public unraveling and responded not with another public performance, but with a decade of quiet, deliberate work. The headlines from 2009 will probably always follow her in some form. But the life she's actually built since then looks far less like a tabloid epilogue and far more like an example of what it looks like to genuinely move on.